Hello, we're going to get started here. I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement. Global Rights for Women gratefully acknowledges the indigenous people of the lands we are on today. Even though we're in a virtual meeting space, it's important for us to recognize that we have benefited and continue to benefit from the theft and occupation of this land since before the United States was formed as a nation. Global Rights for Women is located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the US, and acknowledges that we are on Dakota and Anishinaabe lands. We recognize the discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous people around the world. Additionally, we understand the treatment of Indigenous women is a byproduct of colonialism, racism, and misogyny that has perpetuated the continued sexual abuse, disappearance, and murder of Indigenous women. Please join us in a moment of reflection to acknowledge the harm of the past and present, and to consider how you can help dismantle continued oppression of Indigenous communities and restore justice. Since people are joining us from around the world, at this time, if you'd like to put into the chat the land that you're acknowledging, we'd appreciate it. We'll take a brief moment of reflection. Thank you for coming to Global Rights for Women's conversation series, Valiant Voices. I'm Nicole Lindemeyer, and I'll be today's moderator. I'm the Director of Programs for Global Rights for Women, an organization with the mission to end sexual and domestic violence around the world through systemic and legal change. Valiant Voices is a conversation series Global Rights for Women created that features human rights advocates and survivors who are addressing injustice and disrupting oppressive systems that cause harm. These stories of leaders creating change in their communities from all around the world. We're pleased to share that Valiant Voices is the 2023 recipient of the National Purple Ribbon Award for Outstanding Domestic Violence Podcast. This recognition for excellence would not be possible without our generous donors who support these conversations and the guests who bring their authentic selves, sharing their experience, expertise, and passionate commitment to ending gender-based violence around the world. We welcome your comments in the chat or questions in the Q&A section on Zoom. After the conversation, we'll send out a link with the recording. If you need a certificate of attendance, please contact Sophia Kulo at skulow@grwomen.org. Today we'll be talking about sexual violence. We recognize that there are survivors here. Parts of this conversation may be triggering, so we're including resources for people in the United States and internationally in the chat for those who need safety and assistance. Please take good, gentle care of yourself during and after this conversation. I'm pleased to introduce our panelists to you. Kenosha Davenport is the executive director at the Sexual Violence Center, a community-based rape crisis center situated in Minneapolis, Minnesota. A native of Alabama, Kenosha has 2 decades of work experience in the movements to end gender-based violence, including at least 15 years in executive leadership roles, dual bachelor's degrees in psychology and sociology, a master's degree in business administration, and an array of community service positions. Angelita Olawu serves as the Forensic Nursing Director with the International Association of Forensic Nurses, with over 15 years of nursing experience. In addition to forensic nursing, she has an emergency and trauma nursing background. In her current role, Angelita provides education and technical assistance on topics related to caring for patients experiencing personal violence. Angelita also teaches sexual assault nurse examiner courses and provides education statewide and nationally. And Nicole Campbell is a survivor of sexual assault who has turned her healing journey into righteous advocacy on behalf of other survivors. She has direct experience with the complexities of the court process through the prosecution of her own case, and then underwent extensive training to become a hospital-based advocate for survivors of sexual violence. Thank you all for being here, for joining us. I'm Nicole Lindemeyer. Today's conversation will be about what individuals and systems can do to practice survivor-centered, trauma-informed responses that respect and support survivors of sexual violence. For those of us who work in the field of gender-based violence, we hear the phrase trauma-informed more and more frequently. Knowing and practicing trauma-informed responses is one way we can center survivors' experiences and better accommodate their needs through understanding what might be happening within their own brains. Being trauma-informed is also a way to overcome the long-standing misunderstanding of survivors' own responses during and after sexual assault. We know well how throughout history and continuing through today, victims have been blamed for what happened to them, specifically for not fighting back. Some courts continue to require proof of active resistance during rape in order to establish that the assault was not consensual. In other words, unless she fights back, she must have wanted it. This kind of victim blaming is directly contrary to what we know about the impact of trauma on the brain. Freezing is one of the brain's primal survival techniques, along with fight or flight. Other responses to the trauma of sexual assault are likewise completely justified by the neurobiology of trauma. So let's talk about some of these responses and about the neurobiology of trauma. I'm going to start with a question for Angelita. When we say trauma-informed, what do we mean? What do we mean when we talk about the neurobiology of trauma? And what should we know about it, specifically about the trauma caused by sexual violence?
So thanks for the opportunity to be here and also to address this question. I think the biggest thing that we have to consider when we're thinking about the neurobiology of trauma is that it is a direct response from the brain of whatever trauma is being experienced. So whatever event is occurring, whatever situation that an individual is actually causing a actual chemical reaction to happen within the brain. So the brain has four sections that basically provides this quote unquote response to the brain. Those sections of the brain include the hypothalamus, pituitary, amygdala, and hippocampus. I'm not going to get into a lot of technical details about that, but it is important to know that those are the components that actually cause the response. Each of those components are responsible for very different things, but it's important to understand that one component is actually responsible for actually triggering a hormone release within the system. So what happens is something happens right in front of an individual or happens to that individual that causes this reaction to get triggered. And once that reaction is triggered, one section of the brain will actually send another one a little message that says, "Hey, something bad is happening to me." And so that portion of the brain has to recognize that and then say, we need something to happen to keep us safe, to kind of keep us in survival mode. So it'll trigger that response to happen. Another section of the brain will actually say, okay, let's send some hormones through the body to adjust what we do. And from there, the body will react. So that's kind of a layman's response to that question. So when those chemicals are dispersed, they're dispersed in different amounts, right? And the various chemicals trigger different things. And those, depending how much of those chemicals are actually released, that shows what kind of response that we have. So as you've already said, you can get the fight or flight, you can get a freeze, you can get almost disassociation, where an individual actually may just kind of zone out and no longer be present there. Multiple things can happen, and it can happen multiple, like one thing can be the whole thing, the whole response, or various reactions can happen to that individual. But it's important to understand that that response is going to be individualized to that particular person in that particular moment. It's not going to look the same every single time. And that's important for everyone to understand, that when a person actually presents to them in a traumatic state, that it may look very different. It may look different than me as a healthcare provider, a clinician. It may look different than what I'm expecting. Like sometimes people say, oh, they should be crying or they should be afraid. I may be giggly. I may be stoic. it's it all depends on how my brain has responded and how my brain felt like, what's the best way to keep me safe at this time?
Yeah, thank you for that. That was really um, easy to understand, and I don't have any background in neurobiology. Kenosha,
Amazing.
we're going to move to you. You lead a dedicated team of sexual assault advocates who provide support directly to survivors of sexual violence. From that advocacy perspective, what does it mean to have systems take a trauma-informed approach, including how to hold them accountable to doing their jobs in a trauma-informed way?
All right. Thank you, Nicole, for that question, and thanks for the opportunity to be on this panel. And so, when we think about systems taking a trauma-informed approach, we're not expecting our systems to be advocates. We have advocates to be advocates. But what we are expecting them to do is have a trauma-informed approach that involves recognizing and responding to the impact of trauma on individuals and communities. So when you apply that in a systems framework, it means designing and operating those systems in a way that acknowledges and addresses the potential trauma experienced by victims. So what that can look like is understanding the neurobiology of trauma, right? As Angelita said, not every victim is going to respond in the same way. And so using someone's nervous laughter or non-responsiveness or a non-emotional response as an indicator of truth is not helpful. And so that becomes one of the ways in which they can to have that trauma informed approach is through continuous learning, knowing that as individuals who aren't doing the day-to-day work with victims and survivors, but they're doing the investigative work and the criminal justice work. And so being open to learn, when there's missteps. So they should be open to feedback and continuous continuously strive to improve. Learning from experiences and feedback and research can help them refine their approach over time. So whether that's pulling together focus groups, survivors who have went through those systems and saying, how was that experience for you? How could it have been better? And actually taking that information and using it as the opportunity to improve those systems. Also, being flexible, recognizing that each individual has very different needs and respond to trauma in unique ways. So, being flexible about how and when reports are given. Being flexible, like if a victim or survivor isn't ready at the time of the forensic exam to give a report, that they're being open to like, okay, let us do it in your local rape crisis center, which is going to have a more homier and friendlier environment than down at the police station. And so that flexibility. Then also, the system having a culture sensitivity and realizing that each individual um, may be coming from a different culture. And so there's different things to take in consideration. And so taking that into consideration when interviewing and when following up, and that the system should be culturally competent and then avoid perpetuating stereotypes or biases. Also, systems should empower individuals rather than re-traumatizing them. And so this may involve giving them choices, making sure that they have autonomy, some sense of control over their interactions with the system, not you have to be here Monday. What would it look like to say, are you able, what day this week can we get you in to have a police report done? Do you want to partake in the system? Because a lot of times when crime has happened, they automatically assume that everybody wants to participate in the criminal justice track, and many people don't, and really understand why some cultures or communities may be more reluctant to do so. Really understanding the history of systems and how they have uh, behaved in various communities. It oftentimes is those communities that are already on the margins, and and recognize that someone to engage with the system can be even more traumatizing. And so, how can we reduce the amount of trauma that someone may experience? And then as far as accountability, I think that's the something that many struggle with. How do we hold the systems accountable? And that, you know, and a lot of that is like being unafraid to share what you're seeing as an advocate, as someone in the community, and really speaking up against that. Sometimes that can look really scary, but it's important to provide those opportunities of feedback and saying, how can you do this differently? Hey, you came out with a protocol, you said you were going to do all these steps, and none of those steps have been implemented. And so really using your voice to champion the rights of others.
Absolutely. That absolutely yes, and amen to everything you just said. Nicole, I would love to hear from you. Thank you so much for being here with us today and talking about your experiences as a survivor, especially your experience negotiating the legal system. How were those systems trauma informed or not? And what would have made it better? Was there anything positive about your experience that stood out to you?
Thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to speak. I'm just so grateful to be here. Um, so, in my experience, the legal systems, they are informed about trauma. Maybe it's not something that they experience every single day. And like the rest of the panel have said, everybody experiences trauma in a different way. And so, I think that everybody's informed. Maybe not enough sometimes, but uh, what I experienced was empathy, and from different individuals in the system in every single step. That's what I experienced for the situation, not necessarily for the process, because everybody has a job and everybody's just trying to get their job done, so that you can keep moving forward with the next step. But you're in a traumatic situation, and I know my head was just clouded. I couldn't think of anything, and everybody's asking me to do something, and I'm just trying to survive at that moment. So, what I think would make this better is to have an advocate next to you. And which is why I decided to be a hospital advocate, because I wanted to be right there with, um, I'm going to call them a survivor, because we're going to empower people, but I wanted to be right there with them while they came to the hospital so that I could assess like what they were thinking, how they were acting, um, and then speak for them if they allowed me to. Uh, so I had a positive experience. I also have military experience with sexual assault. That wasn't necessarily as positive as it needed to be. It was the same. I had to prove that this had happened, and everybody didn't believe me. But like Kenosha said, we have to speak up. We have to use our voice and tell people what we experienced so that we could change it for the future, so that another survivor did not experience what we experienced, which also is the same reason why I became a hospital advocate.
So much strength in your story, Nicole. So much
Thank you.
strength. For each of you, in the same order that we just went through, starting with Angelita, I'd love to have you talk about strategies that you could apply to local communities or systems. If you could instantly change one systemic practice to make it more responsive to the needs of survivors, which practice would you change?
Wow, you make it so special by just saying one because there's so many I would work on. But Um, I think really, I think it's really important for collaboration to happen, and I know in many communities that already does happen, but it sometimes it's just an actual response of people and the actual component of collaboration doesn't happen appropriately, right? So when you collaborate, you kind of get to learn about each other, what your roles are, what your job is, as Nicole said, and you learn to work together and to also make sure that each one is kind of doing the best job they can of whatever their job is, right? So from the nursing perspective, as a nurse, I want that advocate to be there. I want Kenosha to be there. I want Nicole to be there with me because as a nurse, I have a very specific role that I'm playing and I want to do the best job that I can. I want to be able to address the clinical things for the patient. I want to be able to address what trauma that patient may be for me as a patient, that patient may be experiencing inside my healthcare system aside from all the other things that are going on, right? I want to be able to acknowledge those things. And I need my advocate to be able to be speaking for the patient, have that voice for the patient, right? If law enforcement has to come in, I want to understand where we can flex a little bit if need be, right? And I want them to understand if I need that flexing as well. So basically, what I'm saying is, I think that it's not just about having people at the table and having people making the response. It's really understanding how you can do it in a smooth manner that's really going to elevate the experience for that survivor, for that patient throughout the process, not just in little windows of spaces. Like, I don't want to have an awesome exam and then the rest of the experience for the patient survivor to be horrible. I would like for us to be able to connect and make that experience the best that it can be across the board.
Yeah, that collaboration is so key. And information sharing where appropriate, so the victim isn't re-traumatized by saying the same stories over and over. Kenosha, what do you think? What would be one aspect you could change if you could?
Well, I think if there was one aspect, it would be that there is no one way to do this. I think sometimes with system, it gets so rigid, like this is our process, we must, and anything outside of that, they go into I cannot compute. So having that flexibility of um, providing options and letting individuals know there are multiple ways in which a report can be taken. One of the great things with our partnership with the Minneapolis Police Department, um, the third precinct is able to respond to our office and have the reports done here. So a victim survivor that is receiving services at the Sexual Violence Center, they can come here regardless of where the crime has happened in the state. And that third precinct would take the report and forward it to the county or city jurisdiction that it needs to go to. And so that is a way in which the system is trauma informed, because here's the person in one of the counties that we serve, and they're needing support of the advocacy, and they don't have to go to an area that may not have advocates available, or and really do it in a place in which they feel safe. And so really understanding and being flexible in how things are accomplished in those systems.
Yeah, that seems totally consistent with what we were talking about earlier about having choice and empowering the survivor to have a choice. If there's only one way to do it right, there's no choice there. So we need those multiple avenues for each step of the system, and the flexibility for the survivor to choose what works for her. Yeah. Nicole, how about you? What's one aspect of a system that you would change if you magically could?
I would put paid positions for advocates in every department that a survivor would hit. That's what I would do.
Oh, goodness, yes. Absolutely, 100%. I think one of the lessons that I've learned in working with Global Rights for Women is how rare it is to have paid advocates at the scene. in any scene. Many countries don't have any public funding for advocacy. And here in the US and in some other more relatively fortunate countries, we have the ability to have advocates placed where survivors need them. But amen. Yeah, the role of an advocate, irreplaceable. Patricia, do we have any questions in the Q&A? I want to make sure that we're being as inclusive as possible of others' voices coming through in the chat.
Yeah, so we did get a question in the chat, and I did get one earlier, but I'll start with the one in the chat, which is how best to incorporate the strategies with social workers. And I think that's in regard to more communication and or coordination. Who would like to take that one on?
I can speak from the medical perspective, thinking about in-house social work and healthcare systems. So, there's a couple of things to really gauge if there's access to forensic nurses or sexual assault nurse examiners. If there is access to these clinicians, then making sure that they are actually um, engaging with social work to help them to understand what the community process has been set up, who are our community responders, who is the advocacy agency that we regularly work with, as well as surrounding, because you may get additional people from different areas. And then just trying to make sure that they have additional training. So today we're talking about neurobiology of trauma. Do they really understand what neurobiology of trauma is? Do they really understand how to create a best response from a trauma-informed manner? That's not just the general normal trauma-informed term that we use, but really specific to sexual assault patients. Um, if by chance there is no forensic nurse or sexual assault nurse in the facility or in the healthcare system, I would say that as a community, especially if there is a local advocacy center, actually reaching out and connecting to the hospital systems that are in your area, and specifically asking to speak with those social workers, asking to speak to the ED managers to get connected with social work so they do have a good understanding of what you offer, how to access you, when you're available. Is it a 24/7 program? Is there a 24/7 call line? Sometimes people kind of make the assumptions that this is already a given thing, and it's not. So just making sure that there is an opening for that kind of communication. And if a healthcare system doesn't ideally normally even provide a response to sexual assault, like if there's something that they're not acknowledging, hate to say it, but it still does happen, it may not be something that is getting prioritized. And that doesn't mean that the social workers in that facility do not care and do not want to do the best thing about it. It just may be that it hasn't been brought to their attention that there's a need. So if you are experiencing communities where you hear like there's a hospital that's not providing response, not even social work, actively engage with those individuals to actually start that relationship building.
Excellent advice. I think, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say we got a question in the Q&A for Nicole Campbell, and that is, how was your experience with prosecutors?
It's tough. It's a tough experience talking with prosecutors. But what I tried to remind myself is that this happened. It happened to me no matter what questions they were asking. And it felt like probing. It was definitely a very vulnerable moment, but they're also just trying to do their job, right? Everybody's just trying to do their job, just trying to get the information that they need from you. But find somebody who can support you while you walk through that process because it happened to you. Do not let somebody tell you that it didn't happen. So, reminding yourself that it happened and that you're answering the best way that you can.
So we have another question that I think is a great follow-up to Nicole's comments. I think it's from Marissa. I think it's incredibly important to make systems responding to sexual violence more culturally sensitive. And I'm curious what this looks like in practice. Do you have any specific examples of adapting systems to make them culturally responsive? I'd like to take that one.
I'm happy to take a try at that one. Well, I think one of the things in order to get there, it's not so much training is just one component of it, but what we know about the systems, whether it's systems here in Minnesota or systems where many of you are, there's a lack of diversity in the system. So we have to start by looking at who's in the system and who's making the rules of the system. And until those two situations become more diverse, then we're always going to be in a like, how do we get them there? How do they get them there? So when the systems begin to be more representative of the people that they're serving and working for, then that's something that's going to be still a problem. I do not have a specific example of what that looks like because I know that it is a struggle for many of our system. That is an ongoing task for many that have taken up the opportunity to improve themselves in that area.
I know in my experience in working, my background is as an attorney and specializing in violence against women and girls of color. Some of the assumptions that I've seen in systems that could stand to be improved on the level of cultural responsiveness come a lot from sort of the schema or the assumptions or stereotypes that individual systems players have in their brains. So I think as much as it is about the systems, the laws, the policies, protocols, practices, it's also incumbent on every single person within those systems to challenge themselves constantly and say, where is this belief coming from? How is this playing out in this interaction that I'm having right now? And how do I challenge myself to be more open-minded instead of prejudging this situation based on uh, social signals and messages that are in my head and manifesting in this interaction? How do I take control of this narrative and honor the victim before me without letting prejudice make my decisions and form my questions for me? I think it's both a systemic and an individual challenge for us to push to be anti-racist within the domestic violence movement, sexual violence movements, and within every other system that victims interact with. It's an ongoing challenge. I don't know. Yeah, I think it's something that, yeah.
I'm sorry. If I can add to that, I just want to encourage us not to also 100% do that. Like that is very, very top priority, but also find a level of comfort of also challenging others. Challenge your colleagues, challenge those people that you share a response to do the same thing that you're doing and speak up. Like speak up when you recognize that someone is not being responded to and treated in a manner that is respectable and appropriate. And if you don't know things, like challenge the research on it, right? I think we have to hold each other accountable too. I think that's really important because sometimes people do feel like they're fine, right? And they will hold that really tight. And sometimes you don't realize it until someone else points out a different perspective of what it actually looks like from from the outside for that person.
Oh, brilliant. I love
Thank
that.
you.
Thank you.
So we do have a question, I think that is another good follow-up to this conversation, which is, are there materials that we can use to work with physicians and nurses to overcome their ingrained thoughts around gender-based violence? So what's out there for people in terms of training, awareness? What would you say would be good steps?
No, Angelita, I bet you're just dying to answer this.
So that's a broad question. I would definitely say to connect. Oh, I'm frozen. I may have been frozen. So sorry. I would definitely say that I would put my information in the chat and maybe reach out and connect to get a little bit more specific. But there's lots of different trainings and resources across all these topics that we're talking about. And sometimes I know we're saying specific to gender-based violence, but sometimes we got to go a little bit higher for them to get that base knowledge and then be able to narrow it down to, okay, what does it look like for this patient population or this group of people individually, right? I hope that makes sense. Because for instance, I'm just going to go with just biases. If people don't understand biases, I can tell you a whole bunch of different things and you'll check off in your brain. Oh, I'm good there. I don't need that additional education and just push it off. Like, oh, I treat this particular patient population great when you haven't even thought about this patient over here, like our deaf patients, let's just say there. It becomes very different. So the point is that I think that you have to kind of look at each organization and see where are we failing? Where do we need additional assistance? Like Kanosh said, are there people here that look like the patients that we're serving, right? If not, why not? If not, how are we treating the people that come here? And looking at your community, is there a larger amount of people that actually should be coming here, but that don't because they don't feel comfortable coming into this space that is not welcoming to them? And if they are coming and they're just being treated bad, then we need to look at why, there's different components to it. Hope that was helpful.
And if I can add to that too, as well, one of the things that I encourage you all to do is check in with your statewide sexual assault coalition. As the board chair of MNCOSA, the Minnesota State Sexual Assault Coalition, oftentimes those statewide coalitions have someone on staff whose primary focus is around working with the medical advocacy piece of it, working with nurses, whether that's training additional SANE nurses, um, and also potentially working with physicians. Some of the statewide coalition also have great training modules. One that comes to mind is West Virginia FRIA, which is the Foundation for Rape and Information Services. And so checking with some of your statewide coalitions and seeing what resources they have available. Consider bringing them in to do a training also for your nurses and physicians. So it's not just you, but who can you collaborate to bring that same information? And I say that with any system. Sometimes it's not best coming from advocacy. Sometimes it's like, all right, what law enforcement person do we know that gets it? And how can we get them in front of them? So bringing in those working with some of those people that are on the national level and getting them to your local level so they can talk to their people about like how to be less crappy in this work. And so that would be my suggestion.
Excellent. Thank you for that.
We have
May I add to all of this?
Go ahead.
I would say also it would be awesome if in the trainings for everybody across the board, if we brought it all the way down to this can happen to you. And how would you react if this happened to you? Because we do trainings, we do all of these trainings, yet it's just sitting there looking at a board or a PowerPoint, and we really need to learn how to make it more personal. That's the only way that anybody's going to change is if they can, unfortunately, see that this can happen to them and how would you like to be treated. So, and I just thought that would be a great add to this conversation.
100%. I think that level of vulnerability We need to experience that. Even if it's just imagine this is you. How would you respond?
Yeah, I think that's a really critical element of a good training session to include that very thing. We have another question from someone looking at emergency contexts in countries where institutions have little to no capacity. Their question is, what is your advice to best ensure a survivor-centered support in places where there might not even be an infrastructure and perhaps the community is responding or other things? So would anyone like to take that question?
I can start and hope someone else will join me. I would just hark back to what Nicole said earlier. The most important step in the process of the trauma resulting from sexual violence is having that connection with an advocate. And while there may not be the financial infrastructure to form or build an advocacy movement of paid advocates, having even volunteer-based, having people in a volunteer advocate role can make all the difference to survivors, having someone there. Nicole, did I capture that, the restating of what you had expressed earlier? Did I get
You
that right?
did. Yes, you did. You did a great job recapturing that. I would also add that if an advocate is not able to be there with you, remembering that you are not alone. You may be alone physically, but there are great resources out here on the internet that you can reach out to, and just trying to remember that physically you're alone, yes, but mentally in your heart, there's a whole group of women or just survivors who want to support you. So reach out and ask questions.
I can chime in. I would gladly chime in. So, thinking from an international level, if if the bridge work isn't there, if the framework isn't there already, and maybe you have some kind of response, but it doesn't look like what we're talking about here. I definitely agree with Nicole and Nicole. I agree that you have to be able to have somebody start the process of advocating, right? And sometimes that looks really different. So in some countries, there's no healthcare response, but we have healthcare people that are there but can't do anything. So they may sometimes start to speak up on behalf of who else needs to be present. How can we make this a better trauma informed process, right? I think it's just getting a start where someone is advocating for what that survivor is experiencing. And how it can be different, right? It doesn't mean that what we are doing here in the US has to be the way, because it may not work for one particular country, but it does mean, can we have a conversation on how we can make this better? And that has to have a voice from the survivor. It has to have a voice from a person who's not doing the actual process to be able and it has to be some open minds there to be able to say, how can we do things a little bit different? I think that's a good place to start. I know that a lot of the technical assistance that we provided internationally kind of came from that. People reaching out to us and explaining to us, this is how things are done where we are at. And what you're doing doesn't apply here, but how can you help us do a better job? And sometimes it's just talking through what works and what resources, like Nicole said, like what resources do we have that we can share so that they can review it and see how they can possibly take components of it or all of it and make it applicable to their community. So I think that's a good start, is having a conversation and someone being willing to keep that continued voice, because it does become frustrating when people aren't listening to you. We all know that, but it looks a little bit more frustrating from the outside anyways.
Thank you for that. I have another question actually came in through email, which is interesting question. What specific integrated strategies are available to support a person who has been unknowingly drugged and then been sexually assaulted, where the individual is left with physical injuries and evidence, but limited or no recall of the assault?
Well, I can speak first, and then I'm sure Kenosha can probably jump in as well. Um, my best advice would be to get the survivor to an actual hospital system. Um, they can get a medical forensic exam, so that is a full, complete, thorough exam. And even if they don't know everything that happens, if they have a trained clinician, they'll gather as much information that they can from the patient on what they remember, don't remember. If the patient is agreeable to have, sorry, I keep using the term patient, but I'm a nurse. If they have the ability to, if they consent to evidence collection, there's the potential for us to still collect evidence, even if you don't know what happened. And then we have the ability to, depending on the time frame, collect specimens of urine and possibly blood um, to test for drugs and alcohol for those patients, those survivors. Um, if that is something that the patient is agreeable to. But most of always, we're going to be having conversations, right? To give you your options, to talk about what exactly can we do for you based on whatever your law is in your jurisdiction. Um, but making sure medically everything is okay. But there are things that can be done to make sure that evidence is collected if that's desired, that a report is made if that's what the patient is desiring, and that you're definitely connected with the appropriate resources. And I'll pass it to Kanisha to talk about from the advocacy standpoint what that looks like, but there's definitely support that should and could happen.
Yeah, and I think you hit a lot of the great points, Angelita. I think it's really important to see what it is that they would like to see happen. And then going from there, explore what options are available. So at the very least, putting them in contact with their closest rape crisis center can be an avenue for them to kind of explore what it is that they want, because they may not even want to go through the criminal justice track. They may be in the position that they want to begin exploring their healing journey. And I believe that the advocates at the rape crisis centers are going to be the best resource for them to be able to start that part of their healing journey. And so then that from there they can explore if they want to move forward, even though there's not a lot of information that they may have. You know, the investigators are trained in the manner that they may be able to help recall. And depending on when this happened, the drugging happened, you know, like is the drugs out of the system? Well, I'm assuming that they are. You know, are they having flashes of memory and stuff? Is stuff coming back slowly? And so having that report made, whether or not they feel that they have enough information, could also be something that's helpful to them as well. And so the question of the day is, what would you like to see happen? And really encouraging them on that path.
Thank you for that. Pat, were there any other questions we could get to?
Well, we have one interesting question. How do you deal with corruption within these systems as survivors seek justice? And I think the
I,
whole seeking justice, this is what we're talking about. So I would like to hear from everyone on the panel today, what you think
yeah,
about addressing these
this is
issues.
Kenosha, and I'm happy to take that one and also hear from the other panels. One of the things is because of the way in which many systems were started, is it corruption or is it just lack of know? Like when we think about the untested kits and that, right? Was it corruption or is it a lack of education? And so, yes, you may have both things happening, right? But what's important is that there are other, because it is a system, they are accountable to the community. Here in Minnesota, when there was some missteps made by the Minneapolis Police Department, the Star Tribune did a series called The Denied Justice. You can find that online. And it interviewed and talked with victims and survivors who were pretty much left to their own devices to kind of investigate their own cases. And it really showed like how that system just was not following up on cases in a way that was helpful or really advanced the case. And so they're looking at, working with journalists or the media to help shine the light on that corruption or those opportunities for them to improve. It was a very powerful tool here in Minnesota, because out of that, the Minneapolis Police Department actually produced they came up with partnerships with local rape crisis centers to have embedded advocates. They also developed a new protocol using a multidisciplinary approach to developing that protocol. So sometimes you have to shine a bigger light on the situation in order to get some change in those systems.
Yeah, I think I would echo what Kenosha said. I'm here in Ohio, and we too had lots of different states have multiple initiatives to specifically address things like that. So for Ohio, part of ours was the Saki initiative to address the untested kits. And based out of that, Ohio actually changed its law to actually test every kit. So every single kit that gets collected gets tested, regardless if the patient is anonymous. If a kit is submitted, a kit is tested. And I think that was one of the ways that, just like Kenosha said, that we're kind of hoping to hold each other accountable. So we know that there's a process. If I'm concerned that maybe someone was assaulted by a law enforcement officer, all of those individuals that are trained will actually know who's the next person that you respond, if that's a local officer, if it's a state trooper, who am I calling as a forensic nurse to actually get this patient connected with to make a report if that's what they're choosing to do? Where am I turning a kid over to if that is the case, to make sure that it's appropriately being handled? So in many places, systems are being put in place and they are being adjusted to try to align to do things better. But I go back to accountability and just reassessment of things. So even when changes are being made, making sure that the appropriate reassessments are being done to see, is this really a fruitful response, and is it making any change the way that we are hoping that the change came?
Ask
Yeah, I
for
think,
someone different. Oh, sorry, Nicole.
no, please go ahead.
I was gonna say, ask for someone different. If you're not getting the help that you're receiving on a very individual level, ask for somebody different. You have every single right to ask for someone who's going to be helpful for you. And that is how we can continue to change the corruption in this system, because then that person's supervisor will know, okay, they were taken off the case, or they were taken off, wherever it is that you're going to be, they will know that, they were taken off of helping you. Hopefully, like we're all saying, there's some form of accountability that comes with maybe that individual being removed from helping you, but you have every right to ask for somebody different so that they can help you.
I think there are some places in the world where corruption is so entrenched in a government or in a law enforcement system in particular, that it can feel almost pointless to look for a systemic response when bribery and other forms of sort of getting what you want is so rampant. And I think the points that were highlighted, using different accountability measures depending on which system you're encountering, having a strong journalist sector to shine a light on corrupt practices, and making sure that at an individual level, a victim is empowered with being able to say, this is not acceptable, I want to see someone else. Those responses may help counter that degree of corruption. I see there's a question that just came in, Pat. Were you going to share that as well?
Yeah, and I was also going to say we have 4 minutes left, and given the conversation, there's been robust commentary in the chat as well. Some of it coming from people who have shared how well they have been also working to make change in their systems and communities. So I think in conclusion, I'd like to briefly hear from each of the panelists in terms of, what is it that gives you hope as we move forward to respond much more adequately to survivors of rape.
Hi, this is Kanosha. One of the things that gives me hope is every day that I see the fire that is in the advocates out there on the front line doing the work, it gives me hope. I feel like the spirit of advocacy has been renewed in our movements to end violence. And so I'm really excited to see where this next generation, our advocates, are going to lead us to.
Angelita,
Yeah.
how about you?
For me, I get hope from seeing so many people doing this work, the increase. I think back to when there was so little and now there's so many more, and that we still have so much need. But what we have right now keeps us engaging in the conversations, both from the system side, but also the general public side, right? People are being a little bit more willing to speak up, not just that this happened to me, but also speak up about how I want to be treated, what I believe justice is, as Kenosha and Nicole both pointed out. That gives me hope that we actually are moving. It may feel slow, but really it is still movement, and it feels good to me. So I'm hopeful about that it continues on.
Nicole, how about you?
What gives me hope is when I walk into the hospital and I get a sane nurse and they are just amazing and totally understand. If I tell them no, they back off. And speaking with the rape centers here, I'm in Minneapolis, and everybody's just doing the best that they can. And the more people that we get involved, which is exactly what we're doing, the better outcome we'll have for everybody. So while it does feel daunting sometimes, there is so much hope out there in individual people, in individual settings that we come across, that our experience is just phenomenal, even if we're in a traumatic time.
Thank you. I'd like to thank our guests for talking to us today and thank our participants for being here. I'd also like to thank my colleagues Patricia Cumby and Sophia Morissette for ensuring this conversation went smoothly on the technological side. We've included links in the chat to learn more. And if you would like to support Global Rights for Women, your contribution goes to supporting the work of advocates around the globe, centering survivor voices as the means to achieving systemic change. You'll receive an email in the next few days with resources, as well as a link to the recording. Once again, thank you so much for being here. It was an absolute honor to share this space with you all. And with that, we will sign off.